There is a moment in every life when the ordinary stops feeling like enough. You wake up one morning, or perhaps it happens slowly over years, and a quiet question begins to surface. Is this all there is? Soul Journey, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his life mapping the hidden architecture of the human mind, gave this restlessness a name. He called it the call toward individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you were trained to be. Jung believed the psyche is not a flat, single thing. It is layered. On the surface sits the persona, the mask we wear for the world, the competent employee, the dutiful parent, the agreeable friend. Beneath that mask lives something older and less tidy. Instincts, memories, unspoken griefs, unclaimed talents, and desires that never found permission to exist. When the ache for meaning shows up, it is rarely a sign that something is wrong with you. It is usually the opposite. It is the deeper self, tired of being ignored, finally making itself heard. Jung noticed this ache tends to intensify in midlife, though it can arrive at any age. In the first half of life, most people are busy building a career, a family, a reputation, a stable identity in the eyes of others. This is necessary work. But Jung observed that the values which serve us well in the morning of life often stop serving us in the afternoon. What once felt like ambition can start to feel like exhaustion. What once felt like belonging can start to feel like performance. The soul, Jung suggested, does not want you to abandon your life. It wants you to stop outsourcing the definition of a meaningful one. This is not a comfortable message, and Jung never pretended it was. He wrote extensively about the suffering that accompanies real psychological growth, because growth of this kind cannot happen without confronting the parts of yourself you have spent years avoiding. The call toward wholeness is not an invitation to a lighter life. It is an invitation to a truer one. What makes this moment so disorienting is that it rarely announces itself clearly. It shows up as a low hum of dissatisfaction that no external achievement seems to quiet. A promotion doesn't touch it. A vacation doesn't touch it. Even relationships that once felt like everything can begin to feel like they are missing some essential ingredient. Jung would say this is because the ache isn't asking for more of the same. It is asking for a different kind of attention altogether. Inward rather than outward. Many people spend years trying to silence this call rather than answer it. They work longer hours. They fill their calendars. They numb the quiet moments with noise, because the quiet moments are exactly when the question resurfaces. Jung had compassion for this avoidance. He understood that turning inward is frightening precisely because you don't know what you'll find there. But he was also clear about the cost of permanent avoidance. A life lived entirely on the surface eventually starts to feel hollow, no matter how full the calendar looks from the outside. The first step of the soul's journey, then, is not action. It is honesty. It is the willingness to sit with the question instead of immediately trying to answer it or escape it. Jung believed that simply naming the ache, admitting to yourself that something in you wants more depth, more truth, more aliveness, is itself a kind of beginning. You do not need to know your destination to take the first honest step toward it. If you have felt this ache, you are not broken, and you are not alone in it. It is, according to Jung, one of the most universal experiences of adult life. The moment the psyche stops asking you to perform and starts asking you to become. What happens next depends on whether you are willing to keep listening. In the next part, we will look at what Jung called the shadow, the hidden material this call is often asking you to face. If the call toward individuation is the invitation, the shadow is the first real threshold you must cross. Jung defined the shadow as everything about ourselves we have pushed out of conscious awareness. Not necessarily because it is evil, but because it didn't fit the image we needed to present to survive, to belong, or to be loved. The shadow holds our unacceptable anger, our unspoken envy, our disowned ambition, our hidden tenderness, our suppressed grief. It is, in Jung's words, the person we would rather not be. And yet it is fully, undeniably part of us. Most people spend enormous energy keeping the shadow out of sight. We do this by projecting it outward. Jung observed that the qualities we criticize most fiercely in other people are often disowned pieces of ourselves, wearing someone else's face so we don't have to recognize them as our own. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you may be mirroring an ambition you were never allowed to claim. The friend whose neediness exhausts you may be reflecting a vulnerability you learned to bury long ago. This is uncomfortable to hear, and Jung knew it would be. He didn't offer shadow work as a pleasant exercise. He offered it as necessary surgery. The danger of an unexamined shadow is not that it stays hidden. It never truly does. Jung warned that whatever we refuse to integrate consciously will express itself unconsciously, often in the most damaging ways. Sudden outbursts that surprise even us, self-sabotage at the exact moment success arrives, patterns of relationship that repeat no matter how much the circumstances change. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. It simply operates from the basement instead of the living room, and things run by the basement tend to make a mess. Jung's radical proposal was that the way through is not to eliminate the shadow, but to meet it, to turn toward the parts of yourself you have judged, exiled, or feared, and ask honestly what they are trying to tell you. Anger you have suppressed for years might be pointing at a boundary you never learned to set. Envy towards someone else's freedom might be pointing at a life you have quietly wanted permission to live. The shadow, once approached with curiosity rather than shame, often turns out to be carrying exactly the energy and information the conscious self has been missing. This does not mean acting out every impulse the shadow contains. Jung was careful here. Integration is not indulgence. It means becoming aware enough of these disowned parts that they no longer control you from the dark. A person who has done real shadow work is not someone without anger, without envy, without darker impulses. They are someone who knows these impulses exist within them and can choose, consciously, what to do with that knowledge. That choice, impossible without awareness, is the beginning of genuine freedom. There is also an unexpected gift hidden in the shadow. Jung noted that we don't only repress negative traits, we often repress positive ones too, especially if they were unwelcome in our early environment. A child raised in a family that valued modesty above all else may bury real talent and confidence in the shadow, right alongside the anger and envy. Meeting the shadow, then, is not only about facing what is dark, it is about reclaiming what was too bright, too big, or too inconvenient for the people around you, and giving it a home again. This work is rarely comfortable, and it is never finished in a single sitting. Jung described it as ongoing, cyclical, something you return to again and again throughout a lifetime. But each honest encounter with the shadow makes you a little less at the mercy of forces you cannot see, and a little more whole. In the next part, we turn to the mask that made the shadow necessary in the first place, the persona, and the cost of living entirely behind it. Before we can understand the shadow's full weight, we have to understand what created it, the persona. Jung used this term deliberately, borrowing from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is the face we present to the world, the professional, the good parent, the reliable friend, the easygoing colleague. It is not inherently false. Jung considered some persona necessary. None of us could function in society if we expressed every private thought and impulse without filter. The problem arises not from having a persona, but from becoming it, mistaking the mask for the whole face. Soul Journey observed this happening most often in people who are, by conventional standards, deeply successful. They have built an identity so effective at earning approval that they lose track of where the performance ends and the person begins. The persona becomes so convincing that even its wearer forgets it's a costume. This is precisely why the ache described in Part 1 so often strikes people who look, from the outside, like they have everything figured out. The mask is functioning perfectly. It's the face underneath that has gone quiet from disuse. The cost of an overdeveloped persona is a kind of internal exile. Feelings, needs, and instincts that don't match the presented image get pushed further and further from conscious awareness, which, as we saw, is exactly how shadow material accumulates. The dutiful employee who never allows themselves to feel resentment ends up storing that resentment somewhere. The eternally cheerful friend who never allows themselves to grieve ends up carrying that grief in the body instead of the heart. Jung believed that psychological symptoms, anxiety, depression, chronic dissatisfaction, often signal not that something has gone wrong, but that the persona has grown too rigid to contain the fuller person underneath. Recognizing your own persona is a strange and humbling exercise. It requires asking questions most people avoid. Which of my traits are genuinely mine, and which were adopted because they were rewarded? Do I actually enjoy this role, or have I simply forgotten there was ever a choice? What would I do, say, or want if no one were watching and no one would judge me for it? Jung didn't intend these questions to dismantle the persona entirely. A person with no persona at all would be unable to function in ordinary social life. He intended them to loosen its grip, to restore a sense of choice about when the mask goes on and when it can come off. There is also a quieter, more intimate cost to persona identification: loneliness. A person who has fully merged with their mask can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen, because no one, including themselves, has met the person behind the performance in years. This is one of the more painful discoveries on the soul's journey, that the very adaptations which earned you love and approval may be the same adaptations now standing between you and being truly known. The work here is not to burn the mask down in one dramatic gesture. Jung's approach was gradual and respectful of the real protection the persona has provided. It begins with small, private honesty, noticing, without needing to act on it yet, the gap between the face you show and the person you are. Over time, that noticing becomes permission. Permission to let a few trusted people see more of you. Permission to want things the role never accounted for. Permission to feel, again, like more than the sum of your responsibilities. Soul Journey believed that a mature relationship with the persona is one of partnership rather than domination. You wear the mask when it serves you, and you set it down when you are safe enough to do so. This is delicate, ongoing work, and it connects directly to the deeper layers of the psyche we'll explore next. The vast, shared inheritance Jung called the collective unconscious. One of Jung's most striking departures from his contemporaries was his belief that the unconscious mind is not only personal. Beneath the layer of memories, wounds, and habits unique to your own life, Jung proposed there exists a deeper stratum shared by all of humanity. A kind of inherited psychological inheritance he called the collective unconscious. This is not memory in the ordinary sense. No one remembers living through it personally. It is closer to a set of universal patterns built into the structure of the human mind itself, expressed across every culture, era, and language throughout recorded history. Jung arrived at this idea partly through his clinical work. He noticed that patients, including those with no education in mythology, religion, or folklore, would describe dreams and visions containing symbols strikingly similar to imagery found in ancient myths from cultures they had never studied. A patient with no knowledge of Egyptian religion might dream of a scarab. Someone unfamiliar with Hindu cosmology might dream of a great wheel turning. Jung concluded that these were not coincidences or borrowed cultural references. They were evidence of something structural, patterns the human mind seems built to generate, regardless of upbringing or exposure. This is part of what made Jung's work so different from the purely personal psychology of his era, where some theories treated the unconscious as simply a storage room for an individual's repressed history. Jung saw the psyche as something that connects each of us, quietly, to every human being who has ever lived and dreamed. The specific content of your personal unconscious, your memories, your particular wounds, is yours alone. But the deep structure beneath it, Jung argued, is held in common. This idea offers real comfort on the soul's journey, especially during the loneliest stretches of it. When you feel most isolated in your struggle, most convinced that no one has ever felt exactly what you're feeling, the collective unconscious suggests otherwise. The themes you are wrestling with: the search for meaning, the confrontation with mortality, the tension between belonging and authenticity, are not unique to you. They are ancient. Every generation has faced some version of them, and something in the deep structure of the mind already contains the outline of how such struggles resolve. This is also why myth, fairy tale, and religious symbol have such enduring emotional power, even for people who consider themselves entirely secular. Jung believed these stories persist for thousands of years, not because of tradition alone, but because they encode something true about the structure of psychological growth. The hero's departure from home, the descent into danger, the transformation, the return. These are not just entertaining plots. Jung would say they are maps of the individuation process itself, expressed in symbolic language, because the psyche often communicates in image and story long before it communicates in plain language. Understanding the collective unconscious can change how you interpret your own inner life. A recurring dream, an unexplainable fear, a sudden and powerful attraction to a particular symbol or story. These are not necessarily random. Jung would encourage you to take them seriously, not as literal fortune-telling, but as messages arriving from a deeper, shared layer of the mind, often carrying exactly the guidance the conscious self has been too busy or too defended to hear. This deeper layer expresses itself through specific, recurring figures, patterns so consistent across cultures that Jung gave them their own name, archetypes. In the next part, we'll look closely at what they are, and how recognizing them in your own life can illuminate the very mission your soul seems to be moving toward. If the collective unconscious is the shared ocean beneath individual minds, archetypes are the currents running through it, recurring patterns of image, role, and story that appear across every culture and era, often without any direct contact between them. Jung identified several archetypes he considered especially central to human psychological life. The hero, who ventures into the unknown and returns transformed. The wise old figure, who carries hard-won knowledge. The great mother, representing nurture and also devouring possessiveness. The trickster, who disrupts rigid order to make growth possible. And the shadow and persona we've already discussed, which are themselves archetypal in nature. Archetypes are not characters you consciously choose. They are more like roles the psyche reaches for automatically, especially during periods of intense transformation. This is part of why certain life transitions feel almost scripted. Leaving home for the first time can feel like a hero's departure. A period of deep loss can feel like a descent into the underworld. Finding a mentor at exactly the right moment can feel like fate handing you the wise old figure precisely when you needed one. Jung would say this isn't superstition. It's the psyche organizing experience through patterns so old and so universal that they feel, in the moment, larger than your individual life. One of the most significant archetypes Jung described is what he called the anima and animus. The inner figure representing qualities a person has not consciously developed, often associated with the opposite gender role as culturally defined, though Jung's core point was less about gender itself and more about wholeness. A person raised to prize toughness and self-sufficiency above all else may carry an underdeveloped inner life of tenderness, receptivity, and emotional fluency. An inner figure Jung might describe as unclaimed. Meeting this inner figure, rather than only projecting it outward onto romantic partners, is part of what Jung considered essential to becoming whole. Recognizing archetypal patterns in your own life can be genuinely clarifying. If you feel pulled again and again toward mentoring others, you may be responding to the wise archetype seeking expression through you. If you feel a persistent, almost irrational pull to disrupt systems that others accept without question, the trickster energy may be alive in you, insisting that rigid structures need loosening before real growth can occur. If you feel a deep call to protect, nurture, and create safety for others, the Great Mother archetype may be finding its channel through your particular gifts and circumstances. Soul Journey was careful to note that archetypes are not destiny in a fixed sense. They are patterns available to be lived out consciously or unconsciously. Lived unconsciously, the hero archetype can turn into reckless self-endangerment. Lived consciously, it becomes courageous, purposeful risk in service of real growth. Lived unconsciously, the Great Mother can become smothering control. Lived consciously, it becomes generous, boundary-respecting care. The task Jung set before us is not to avoid these deep patterns. That isn't possible, but to become conscious enough of them to express them with wisdom rather than compulsion. This is where the earlier steps of the journey connect. The shadow work of Part 2, the honest reckoning with persona in Part 3, and the recognition of shared human patterns in Part 4 all build toward this. An ability to notice which archetypal energies are moving through your life right now, and to choose, with awareness, how you will embody them. This is not about discovering a single grand cosmic mission assigned to you before birth. It is about recognizing the deep, ancient patterns already alive in your ordinary days and inhabiting them with more consciousness than compulsion. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe a phenomenon he found difficult to explain through ordinary cause and effect: meaningful coincidence. Not every coincidence qualifies. Jung was specific that synchronicity describes events which are not causally connected, yet feel undeniably meaningful to the person experiencing them, often arriving at exactly the moment they carry the most psychological weight. You think intensely of an old friend after years of silence, and the phone rings moments later with their name on the screen. You are wrestling with a decision, and a stranger's offhand comment on a train addresses the exact question you hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. Jung did not propose synchronicity as evidence of magic in a supernatural sense. He proposed it as evidence that the inner and outer worlds are more deeply connected than a strictly mechanical view of reality allows. That meaning itself might be a genuine organizing principle in the universe, running alongside cause and effect rather than replacing it. This was, even in his own time, one of his more controversial ideas, and Jung himself approached it with more curiosity than certainty. Whatever its ultimate explanation, Jung believed synchronicity mattered enormously to the psychological journey, because these moments tend to arrive at thresholds, right when a person is on the verge of a significant shift in awareness. A synchronistic event can function like a confirmation, a nudge, or a mirror, reflecting back something the unconscious has already been working toward. It rarely hands you an answer outright. More often, it simply lets you know you are being paid attention to by something larger than your isolated, conscious mind. Whether you understand that something as the deep structure of a shared unconscious, as fate, or simply as the mind's heightened sensitivity to pattern during moments of change. This has practical value on the soul's journey. Learning to notice synchronicity, without over-relying on it, without turning every minor coincidence into cosmic instruction, cultivates a particular kind of attention. It trains you to stay alert to your own life rather than sleepwalking through it. People who dismiss every coincidence as meaningless and people who treat every coincidence as a divine sign are, in Jung's framework, making the same mistake from opposite directions. Both are failing to hold the tension between mystery and discernment that real psychological maturity requires. A useful practice, in Jung's spirit, is not to chase synchronicities, but to record them. When something coincidental strikes you as unusually meaningful, note it, along with what you were feeling or wrestling with at the time. Over months, patterns tend to emerge. Not proof of destiny, but a kind of dialogue between your inner state and your outer life, visible only in hindsight. This dialogue, Jung would suggest, is one of the ways the deeper self communicates with the conscious mind. Not through commandments, but through resonance. It's worth being honest about the risk here too. The same openness that lets you notice meaningful coincidence can, taken too far, slide into a kind of magical thinking that avoids responsibility. Waiting for a sign instead of making a decision, or interpreting random events as proof you are specially chosen for a particular destiny. Jung's own approach was more grounded. Synchronicity is a companion to conscious effort, not a substitute for it. It can illuminate the path. It cannot walk it for you. As we move toward the later parts of this journey, we come to the stretch Jung considered the most difficult and the most necessary, the descent. In the next part, we look at why the psyche so often has to go down before it can rise, and why this isn't punishment, but the shape transformation naturally takes. Nearly every tradition of transformation, psychological, spiritual, mythological, contains some version of the same structure. Before renewal comes a descent. Jung observed this pattern so consistently across cultures that he considered it close to a psychological law. Real transformation is rarely gentle. It tends to arrive through crisis. The loss of a relationship that forced you to define yourself outside of it. The collapse of a career that revealed how much of your identity depended on external validation. An illness or loss that stripped away every distraction and left you alone with fundamental questions you had spent years avoiding. Jung called this period, in some of his writing, a kind of necessary darkness. Not evidence that something has gone catastrophically wrong with your life, but evidence that an old structure has become too small to hold who you are becoming. The old persona cracks. Old certainties stop making sense. Old sources of meaning go quiet. This is disorienting precisely because it removes the scaffolding a person has relied on, sometimes for decades, without offering an immediate replacement. Jung was honest that this stretch of the journey can feel less like growth and more like loss, because, in a very real sense, it is a loss. The old self genuinely has to die for a more integrated one to take its place. This is the part of the journey most people try hardest to avoid, and understandably so. Jung noted that many people, sensing this descent approaching, will do almost anything to prevent it, throwing themselves into distraction, forcing old routines to keep working past their expiration date, numbing the discomfort with overwork, substances, or constant noise. He had compassion for this avoidance. No one seeks out disintegration voluntarily. But he was also clear that avoidance simply postpones the descent rather than preventing it, and often makes the eventual crisis more severe when it can no longer be delayed. What makes this period bearable, according to Jung, is understanding its shape. A descent that feels endless in the moment nearly always has a floor. The old myths Jung studied so closely rarely end with the hero lost in the underworld forever. They end with a return, carrying something the hero did not have before entering the dark. This is not a promise that suffering is instantly redeemed or that pain becomes acceptable simply because it serves a purpose. It is a recognition that this particular kind of suffering, the kind tied to genuine psychological transformation, tends to move, given enough honesty and enough time, rather than staying static forever. Practically, this stretch of the journey asks less for solutions and more for endurance paired with honesty. Jung encouraged people going through this kind of crisis to resist the urge to immediately rebuild the old structure out of panic, and instead to stay present with the discomfort long enough to learn what it is actually pointing toward. What identity is being asked to die? What belief about yourself no longer holds true? What have you been protecting that no longer needs protecting? These questions rarely have quick answers, and Jung didn't pretend otherwise. But asking them honestly, even slowly, is different from simply suffering blindly. It also helps enormously, during this stretch, to have companions, whether a trusted friend, a therapist, or a community that has weathered something similar. Jung worked with patients precisely because he believed this kind of descent, while deeply personal, was never meant to be navigated in total isolation. The presence of someone who can bear witness to your disorientation without rushing you out of it is, in itself, a form of support the psyche badly needs during this phase. The descent, difficult as it is not the end of the story. It is the passage that makes the final stage possible. The gradual, ongoing process of integration Jung called individuation, the subject of our final part. We arrive, finally, at the concept that gives shape to everything discussed so far, individuation. Jung used this word to describe the lifelong process of becoming a fully integrated, undivided self. Not perfect, not conflict-free, but whole in the sense that the different parts of the psyche, the persona, the shadow, the archetypal patterns, the conscious and unconscious mind are in genuine relationship with one another rather than locked in silent war. Individuation is not a destination you arrive at and then stop growing. Jung considered it a direction, pursued gradually and imperfectly across an entire lifetime. It's worth being precise about what individuation is not. It is not becoming someone entirely new, unrecognizable from who you were before. It is not achieving permanent peace, free from doubt or difficulty. It is not a state reserved for the exceptional few, unlocked through extraordinary spiritual achievement. Jung was insistent that individuation is available to ordinary people living ordinary lives. The office worker, the parent, the shopkeeper, the retiree. because the process happens through the raw material of everyday experience. Everyday conflicts, everyday relationships, everyday disappointments, all approached with a bit more consciousness than they were before. Everything explored across this journey feeds into individuation. The honest reckoning with the ache described in Part 1 opens the door. Meeting the shadow in Part 2 reclaims disowned material and returns stolen energy to conscious use. Loosening the grip of the persona in Part 3 restores a sense of choice about which parts of yourself the world gets to see. Recognizing the collective unconscious in Part 4 dissolves the isolating belief that your struggles are uniquely, hopelessly your own. Noticing archetypal patterns in Part 5 gives shape and dignity to experiences that once felt confusing or shameful. Paying attention to synchronicity in Part 6 cultivates a quality of attention that keeps you engaged with your own life rather than sleepwalking through it. And surviving the descent in Part 7 provides the raw, hard-won material that individuation actually integrates, because there is no shortcut to wholeness that skips the parts of yourself you were once afraid to face. Jung believed that a person moving toward individuation becomes, gradually, less reactive and more responsive, less at the mercy of unconscious patterns repeating themselves, and more capable of conscious choice even in difficult moments. This does not mean the difficult moments stop coming. Loss still hurts. Uncertainty still unsettles. Relationships still require real, ongoing effort. What changes is your relationship to these experiences. Less white-knuckled resistance, more grounded presence, less compulsive repetition of old patterns, more genuine choice about how to respond. There is also a quieter, relational gift that comes with individuation. A person who has done real work toward wholeness tends to relate to others differently. Less through projection, seeing in others only what you refuse to see in yourself, and more through genuine encounter. Relationships built on two people doing this work, even imperfectly, tend to have a different texture. More honesty, more capacity to hold conflict without collapse, more room for both people to be fully, complicatedly themselves. Jung never promised that this journey ends in permanent ease. What he offered instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. A life lived with more awareness than before, more honesty with yourself than before, and a growing capacity to meet whatever arrives. Joy or grief, connection or loss, without needing to hide from it or from yourself. This, in Jung's own understanding, is not a finish line. It is simply what it looks like to keep walking the path consciously, one honest step at a time, for as long as the walking continues. The soul's journey, understood this way, was never about fulfilling a hidden cosmic destiny assigned before birth. It was always closer to this, the daily, patient, often uncomfortable work of becoming more fully yourself, and discovering, in that becoming, a kind of meaning no external achievement could ever quite provide.